In this example, I want to look at how I can take Lambda and connect to DynamoDB. So in DynamoDB, I have my baseball stats table that I've been working with all semester. And the baseball stats table you can see is located in the Ohio region, which is US East 2. So that's going to be important when we're connecting from Lambda, that the table is actually located in US East 2. So that baseball stats table, if I look at it, is going to have a partition key of team ID and a sort key of SK. And if I look at the table items, you'll see I have 36 items. I've added a few extra. So it's the same data set that we've been working with this semester. Okay, so from US West 1 is where I'm working in Lambda. I want to connect to that DynamoDB table that's located in US East 2. And I want to start with a scan. So I want to look at all of the records in that baseball stats table. So I'm going to create a function, and I'm going to call this scan dynamo. Okay, so NodeJS 20 is fine. I'm going to go ahead and create the function. Okay, so in my source code, there's a couple of things that I have to import. So I have to import the scan command. So I'm going to import the scan command. And I'm importing that from the AWS SDK. And it's the client dynamoDB. Okay, so I'm going to import the scan command. And then the other thing that I have to import is I have to actually import the dynamoDB client. And again, that's from the AWS SDK. And then client dynamoDB. Okay, so those are the two things that I need to have access to. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new instance of that dynamoDB client. Okay, so I'm going to create a new instance of the dynamoDB client. I'm just going to call that dynamoDB client. And that's going to be equal to a new dynamoDB client. And in this case, I'm going to pass in a parameter, which is the region. So I actually want to connect to the region being US East 2. Okay, so that's the parameters that I'm passing in when I create that DynamoDB client. Okay, some parameters. So if I'm going to do a scan, traditionally when I do a scan, if we were looking at this from the AWS CLI, when I do a scan, I specify an endpoint URL, and I also specify a table name. So the table name is really the one parameter that's going to be required here, because we're not going to be connecting to our local instance of DynamoDB, but we are going to have to specify which table. So I'm going to have params that's going to be equal to the table name being baseball stats. Okay, so that's the one parameter that I'm going to have. And then all this stuff can go. Okay, so we have our DynamoDB client, we have our parameters, and now what I want to do is I want to make sure that I have some exception handling in place. So I'm going to catch my exception, and if I do run into an error, I'll do a console.log of the EX. And instead of console.log, I'll do console.error. Okay, so I'm just going to log that error message if there is an error message. But in this try block, this is where the source code is actually going to exist for me to actually try to connect to the DynamoDB client. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to get some data, and the data is going to come from my DynamoDB client. And I'm going to send my new scan command, and my new scan command is going to be with my parameters. Okay, so when I do this, what's going to happen is this is actually an asynchronous call. So if I actually want the data to be available to me, I have to await the data. Okay, so I'm going to await the data. Okay, and then once I get that, I'm going to return the data. Okay, and I want to test this out and see how it goes. Okay, so I want to test it, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new test event, dynamo scan test. The event JSON, I really don't need any data to come in. Okay, so I'm just going to pass an empty object, and I'm going to save that. And I want to test this out. Okay, so when I test it out, you'll see that I get that hello from Lambda. It's still running my old source code, and that's because my changes haven't been deployed yet. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy those changes. Okay, so it says it successfully updated the function. Okay, and now I'm ready to test it again. And you'll notice I get null is my response. But if I look a little bit further in my function logs, and this would be in CloudWatch, but if I look at my function logs, you'll see I get an error, access denied exception, this user, and it's basically telling me that role. And if you remember, what ends up happening is when I set up this function is configured with an IAM role that has access to execute the code, but that's it. And what I need in this case is I need that role to be able to access dynamoDB so that I can run this scan. Okay, so I'm going to go to the configuration tab, and I'm going to go to the permissions, and I'm going to jump over to IAM with this role. And as a matter of best practice, I would probably be real specific about what permissions that role is going to have. So I might make it a read-only role because we're doing a scan. But just for the sake of time and convenience, what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach a policy, and I'm going to make them a Dynamo full access user. So I'm just using the built-in policies. So read-only, execution role, right? So I'm giving them full access. Okay, so now my code has full access to DynamoDB. So I've modified this role. I can close IAM and test it again. And now you'll notice I'm getting this response. So I'm getting some metadata. It attempted. I have 36 items, and then the items are right here. So each object in that data set. Okay, one thing you're going to notice is if you've worked with JSON data before, I particularly wouldn't like to work with this JSON data. And the reason I say that is because if this is my player object, so if I'm looking at Albert Pujols right now, so I'd see his SK is 5, his player name's Albert Pujols, team ID player info underscore LAA, and then position 1B. If I actually wanted to access, for instance, the player name, I'd look at this object and I'd say dot player name dot s, because this is a string data to get Albert Pujols. And I always think that's kind of strange to do the dot s. Or if I was looking at, if I look at a game, you'll see that not all of it is string data. There's numeric data as well. I don't know if there's actually, yep, right here's a game. You'll see that the runs scored is a numeric piece of information. So if I wanted to access the runs, I'd look at this game, and then I'd do dot runs dot n to get the value 3 out of it. It always strikes me as weird. So what that's known as is it's known as marshaled data, where each attribute has the corresponding data type along with the value. And I prefer unmarshaled data. So one thing I can do is I can import the marshal and unmarshal library. So I'm going to go ahead and import the marshal and unmarshal from the AWS SDK, not client DynamoDB, but util DynamoDB. Okay, and ideally I get this data back and I can see what the data is, right? So if I look back up at the top, I have this object that has a collection of items, and I only really care about the items. Okay, so that's what I really care about are these items. I don't necessarily care about the rest of the data. So if I'm looking at the items, what I can do is I can then, instead of just returning the data, what I can do is I can get the unmarshaled items. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to use a JavaScript function. I'm going to say data.items. Okay, so that's the JSON. So I'm saying I want to go into the data, which is this object, this outer curly brace, dot items, which is this attribute, which points at an array of all the objects in the data set. So data.items, and then I can map over them. And then basically what I'm saying is for each item, what I want to do is I want to unmarshal that item. Okay, and if you're more comfortable with the syntax item, okay, so I just have a variable called item, and I'm going to unmarshal that item. Okay, and what that does, that map function, is going to return an array of all the items, but it's going to be in the unmarshaled state. And then what I want to do is I want to return these unmarshaled items, not just the regular data set. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and deploy those changes. And now if I test this again, what I should see is I should see the data, the exact same data, but only the items, and now the items are going to be in their unmarshaled state. Okay, so now you'll notice that I just have this array of items, and each item is in its unmarshaled state where I don't have a data type associated with each attribute, right? So the player name is just the value, the team ID is just the value, the position is just the value. So now if I'm looking at this particular record, I can just say dot team name, and I don't have to do dot team name dot s to access Oakland Athletics. Okay, so what we've done is we've imported some NodeJS dynamoDB client libraries, so the scan command and the dynamoDB client. We're able to pass the parameters that we needed for the scan, which is just the table name. And then once we do that, we're able to issue the scan command to get our data set back. And then lastly, what we did, just kind of as a nicety, is we took it out of its marshaled state and we unmarshaled those items so that we didn't have to have the associated data type with each individual value for each attribute of our data set. Okay, and we're getting that data from our function call. Okay, so now we have a Lambda function that can connect to DynamoDB and pull data out of our DynamoDB data set.